Hello everyone, and welcome to the 279th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Obsession. If you like my videos, consider signing up to become a patron over on Patreon, where you can get access to my videos a day early, ad-free, and uncensored for as little as $2 a month. To say that Obsession has become a phenomenon is an understatement, and considering how fantastic of a film it is all around, that only makes sense, and the evil found within this story is beautifully crafted and more than deserved to be discussed in an episode in this series, and that's what we're going to do here. So without further ado, let's begin. Though there's a critical element in this story that facilitates the evil that unfolds within, all of what happens here, every single thing, begins and ends with one person, and one person only, Baron Bailey, otherwise known as Bear. We don't know too much about Bear's backstory, but at some point in time Bear moved to the town this story takes place in either with his Nana or to live with her, and that she passed away sometime before the events of this film. But why he moved there is never told to us, and other than this small piece of information, we have nothing to go off of as far as what elements present in Bear's past may have contributed to him developing into the man we see in this film. Based on his overall character, I think it's reasonable to assume that Bear was likely starved for attention throughout his childhood, either when he did live with his parents, because he never really had parents, because his Nana may not have been the most attentive caregiver, or perhaps due to a combination of all three. However, whatever there is to be divined about what contributed to Bear becoming the man he is in this film is purely speculative. What isn't up for interpretation though is the fact that Bear is a self-absorbed, needy, insecure, and cowardly young man whose ego-driven desire to win Nikki's affection for the sake of his own satisfaction and inability to obtain that love through regular means is what made all the horrendous events that played out over the course of this film a possibility. And the signs that Bear was the man capable of making all this happen were there from nearly the very beginning of this story. When we're first introduced to Bear in the opening of the film, he seems innocent enough, more than innocent in fact, a nervous young man who's unsure how to approach women that desperately wants to learn how. In these first few moments, Bear seems sweet, anxious and love-struck, but sweet nonetheless, a man in love who seems to have developed these feelings for Nikki over the course of many years, who can't help the way he feels for a girl who seems to have treated him with love and care, and who's always been the first person there for him in times of need. But it's in the very next scene that we're shown that there's something not quite right with Bear. After returning home from an outing a few days later, Bear finds his cat Sandy dead on the floor, poisoned after somehow getting into his grandmother's leftover pain medications and dying as a result. Curiously though, when Bear examines the scene and begins cleaning it up, he seems rather calm. He did express some degree of sadness when he first discovered her corpse, but the way he investigates, cleans, and then disposes of Sandy's corpse via a trash bag, which he then just throws away, is odd behavior for a person who just discovered their pet lying dead on the floor. Now to be fair, Bear might not have been too upset here because Sandy might have been his grandmother's cat, and he didn't have much attachment to her. But even if that's not the case, and he did have an attachment to Sandy, when examining what a person does in the moments after they experience a sudden influx of grief, you have to keep in mind that grief is often irrational, so Bear could just be numbly going through the motions here, which seems to be the case considering the next scene shows Bear sobbing. But it's this very scene that shows us that what we saw Bear doing in the previous scene weren't the robotic motions one might expect a grief-stricken man to go through, as between his sobs here, we hear him say, "Why can't she just," before the camera pans down to the word obsession at the end of his bed, and then immediately cuts to Bear lying on his bed in the dark and scrolling through Nikki's Instagram profile. Why this is so important is because these few words uttered in the wake of what should have been a heart-wrenching event shows us that Bear is experiencing grief here, but not for Sandy, but for the love he feels he'll never receive from Nikki. Why can't she just what? Sandy can't do anything. She's dead. So if he were talking about Sandy here, you'd think he'd say something more like, why didn't she? Why did she? How could she? When trying to process and come to terms with the fact that his cat had just passed. But no, it's, why can't she just? And though we never hear what Bear wants from this mysterious she, we can only assume that sentence in its entirety was, why can't she just love me? Which is only supported by the aforementioned accompanying scene where he's scrolling through Nikki's profile. Now it's more than likely that Bear's sobs here were partially brought on by Sandy's death, but it's rather telling of Bear's character that in this moment, where he should have been entirely focused on the death of his cat, that his mind was more so centered on his desire for Nikki and the fact that she doesn't love him in the way he wants her to. What further supports the idea that Bear wasn't fazed by his cat's death is how nonchalantly he brings up Sandy's passing when he's out at trivia night. And if it weren't for the fact that he in all likelihood doesn't care about this cat very much, maybe this would have been another instance of grief causing people to do strange things and act strangely, as he does admit to Nikki while he's driving home that the death of Sandy isn't okay, but that it hasn't hit him yet. But because I think we can reliably assume that the reason it hasn't hit him yet is because such an event doesn't affect Bear in the way it might affect others because of what he is, the moment where he brings up Sandy's death is what reveals to us what he is: a narcissist. Now initially, that might sound strange, as Bear's narcissism, or the fact that he's a narcissist at all, is not what you typically might expect. And that's fantastic, as like anything, narcissism, or narcissistic personality disorder, is on a spectrum, and not every narcissist is the stereotypical egomaniac who spends most of their free time kissing their own reflection. No, Bear is not a malignant narcissist whose behavior is overtly egotistical. He's a subtle narcissist, a poor me narcissist, one who believes that the world is a cruel place that has made life unfair for a man who deserves to be loved and wanted. And this only becomes more apparent as this story progresses. But why is this casual mention of Sandy's death our first indicator that Bear is a narcissist? Because this is a tactic that narcissists like Bear use to get the attention they feel they deserve or need. What happens as soon as Bear brings up Sandy's death? Well, Nikki and Ian don't hear him, so they walk off. But Sarah does. And what does she do? She hugs him and offers him her condolences. But that's something natural for someone to do in this situation. So again, why is this a sign that Bear is a narcissist? Because of the way Bear brought up Sandy's death. And why? Just prior to him bringing up Sandy, Bear was interrupted by Ian and then Sarah while he was talking to Nikki and trying to score points with her. And so in a moment where the attention he felt he deserved and this opportunity to further his goals was taken from him, he chose to reveal something that would instill pity within those around him so they would then redirect their attention back to him, with the hope that Nikki especially would do so and lavish him with the tender affection and attention that he craves from her. Which is made even more evident by the fact that when Sarah hugs him, he first smiles and then looks increasingly distraught as his eyes slowly move towards the path Nikki and Ian took as they walked away, showing us that he's likely staring at Nikki, wishing that Sarah were her. Now, where does a person learn to behave like this? Well, it's actually natural, as it's something that we all know to do inherently from birth. What does a baby do when they need something? Well, they sure don't ask politely. They cry and scream, which are the only things they can do to express to anyone around them that they're in distress and that they need attention. Now, as we grow older, this behavior typically lessens as we develop better forms of communication to use to express our needs and realize that affection and attention from others is earned and is not something that should be coerced out of others. But even in toddlers or young children, you'll find that they'll cry for seemingly no reason at times, or even fake injuries to get your attention and your affection. But again, at some point though, this behavior does typically stop. But if you weren't given much attention when you were a kid, then it's more likely than not that you continue to behave like this throughout childhood, and possibly even into your teenage years and beyond. And this is the case for Bear. Bear, who was likely starved of attention for the majority of his young life as I mentioned earlier, is on the inside still a baby who knows that the quickest way to get their caregiver's attention is to cry as loud as he can, and the kid who would scream Bloody Mary over a scrape so long as someone would notice him and give him some attention for a while. Now, you can't really fault a kid who feels forced to resort to this kind of behavior to get attention for doing so, as we all, especially when we're children, require the attention of our parents or other caregivers in order to develop into well-adjusted adults. So of course Bear, who likely was that attention-starved kid, would develop into an adult who felt that coercing people into paying attention to him and lavishing him with affection was an okay thing to do. And that's the difference between the average person who understands that using their cat's death specifically for the sake of getting people's attention and gaining their affection is wrong, and a narcissist like Bear who, whether instinctually or purposefully, only cares about what such a situation can do for him and his desire to be loved, in this case, by Nikki specifically. Now, in accordance with the title of this film, Bear is an obsessive, a person who, once they feel that something or someone belongs to them, will stop at nothing to make sure that they do indeed belong to them. That isn't to say that crushes like the one Bear has on Nikki are inherently bad things. Far from it, as plenty of beautiful love story have begun with the affections of one person for another slowly becoming known over time, and a relationship blossoming as a result. But here is the crucial difference between someone like Bear who wants the person they're infatuated with to love them no matter what, and a person who's looking to find love. If you're looking to find love, you're doing just that. You're moving through the world anticipating that at some point, the right person is going to come along who you're going to make a connection with, that you're then eventually going to fall in love with, and they you. And when these feelings begin as a crush, a well-adjusted person will pursue the object of their desire, and then either win their affections and proceed to live happily with them, or they'll fail to do so for any number of reasons, and move on. But for someone who's obsessed with another, there is no moving on, only the mad drive to win their affections no matter what it takes. And if there is, moving on for them typically manifests itself in dark thoughts and spite-filled condemnations of the person they were obsessed with. the bitch or asshole who couldn't see the prize sitting right in front of them, who, for the rest of their days, is going to have a special place in their mind as a monster who should have known better. For the love that people like Bear wish to extract from others is always for themselves, and themselves alone. They don't love the person they're obsessed with. They love the idea of them and what they think they'll bring to their lives, the romanticized version of them that they believe will result in the manifestation of true love, when in reality, romance, while being important in any loving relationship, is not the same thing as love. And for the obsessed, the care they show their obsession is only ever shown as a means to that end. And we see this with Bear and Nikki when he's driving her home, and they have a conversation about Nikki putting in her 2 weeks at their job. Bear starts off by saying it's going to be weird not seeing you every day. And when she says she isn't happy there, he replies, "It's just a job, Nikki." Notice how he completely ignored the fact that she wasn't happy here, and instead tried to offhandedly convince her that she shouldn't be because it's just a job. Bear isn't hearing Nikki at all here. All he's hearing is that soon enough, he's going to have reduced access to the woman he's obsessed with, and so his mind immediately jumps to any response that could cause her to reconsider quitting. There is no, "I'm sorry you're unhappy," "Oh, I didn't know you were unhappy," or well wishes, only an attempt to get her to go in the direction that he wants her to go. After this, she responds by saying, "Yeah, well, I want to write," and he says, "I mean you are," which is only more of the same. But then Nikki pours her heart out to Bear by saying, "No, I feel like I need a big life change. I'm not feeling love, and I want to feel love if I want to bring the story to life." Bear's response, with a smirk on his face, he says, "Love? So it's a romance?" Nikki responds by saying, "No, it's not a romance. It's a love story." To which Bear says, "Aren't they the same thing?" But this entire conversation for Bear is all about manipulation, guiding Nikki towards reconsidering her decision and belittling her dreams so she might stay with him and forget about any silly aspirations that might pull them apart. He doesn't see a woman he cares for who's unhappy and only wants to fulfill her dreams, only the woman he believes should be his, slipping through his fingers. This is only made worse when Nikki admits that Bear is her only confidant, the friend she relies on seemingly just as much as he relies on her for comfort and security, which adds another layer of depravity to Bear's actions here. This is who Bear is, an attention-starved narcissist obsessed with another woman who spends his days and nights pining for her and fantasizing about being with her, but never really knowing how to make his fantasies a reality. For as much as Bear is this obsessive, he is also a deeply insecure, awkward, and anxiety-ridden man. And with both fear of being rejected and this incessant fantasy of the perfect woman he's in love with constantly running through his mind, this has caused Bear to become a coward in many ways. Not just because he's afraid of rejection, but because in his mind, the only way to win Nikki's love is through perfection. The perfect words, the perfect moment, the perfect gift. When in reality, interactions between human beings are rarely perfect, and the only perfection as far as love is concerned comes about when things are organic, when you let yourself live in the moment and respond to another person with the genuine warmth and care that anyone you might love deserves. But for a man like Bear, even when that perfect organic moment is staring him right in the face, he's incapable of capitalizing on it, with fear and anxiety clouding his judgment and pushing him into believing that he's just going to make himself look stupid and ruin everything if he doesn't do everything perfectly like the way he imagined. And that's the tragedy of Bear's character. For if he could have stepped out of his own head for just a moment, he'd have realized that everything he desired was likely a lot more achievable than he might have thought, as by all accounts, Nikki seemed to have feelings for Bear. It seems ambiguous, especially when you consider that Nikki supposedly told Sarah that she saw Bear as a little brother. But people tell little white lies to hide their true affections for people all the time. And as Nikki said, when she has a crush on someone, nobody knows. But in that moment when Nikki asked Bear outside her house if he liked her, I have a feeling that if he admitted he did, that would have been that, and their relationship would have blossomed from there. And though that relationship might have ended up being toxic because of who Bear is, none of the horrendous things that occurred in this story would have ever happened. But with Bear behind the wheel, that was always an impossibility, and though he couldn't have known what was coming next, he's still very much to blame for all the horrid things that happened after he made his wish. I wish Nikki Freeman loved me more than anyone in the fucking world. A wish made believing that it would end up being what all wishes typically are, nothing. A prayer made with the breaking of a novelty toy that anyone would have assumed was as meaningless as could be. But here, in this story, it meant everything. From this moment on, the woman known as Nikki Freeman would be replaced and imprisoned somewhere beyond the ethereal veil that separates this world from the otherworldly, and in her stead would come a creature that we'll refer to going forward as not Nikki. But who or what is not Nikki? Well, at first, I thought maybe she was a demon and that Nikki had been possessed by some sort of succubus. But Curry Barker confirmed that what we're witnessing here isn't demonic possession. And while we may never know just exactly what's going on here, when we take a closer look at not Nikki's behavior, the probability that she's something very specific becomes much more likely. That being nothing. Nothing at all. Now what I'm about to say is purely speculation, and I could be completely off base here, right on the money, or somewhere in between. But that's the beauty of interpretation and film analysis, as it's often the case that any given person who watches a movie will come away with a different take than the next. So if you have a different take, please let us all know down below. Now, when Bear makes his wish, Nikki instantly begins acting strange, with her making confusing statements about Bear's cat, and her demeanor shifting between giddy, manic, intense, and sorrowful in the span of just a few minutes, which is entirely out of character for her, even if we've only been exposed to her overall personality for a short amount of time. But as you all know well, this behavior only grows increasingly more strange as the film progresses, and the moments where Nikki manages to pierce through the prison she's seemingly been placed in are what emphasize for us the most that whoever this is, it's not Nikki. So who or what is it? If it's not a demon, what could this clearly separate entity be? Well, I mentioned a moment ago that she's nothing, and what I meant by that is that not Nikki was essentially a blank slate of some sort that got infused with the real Nikki in order to make Bear's wish possible. If we think of the wish-granting process like computation, as the magic that fuels the One-Wish Willow was calculating how to grant Bear his wish, it found that the real Nikki was incapable of loving him more than anyone else in the fucking world. So it grabbed her soul and placed a completely blank one into her body that it then downloaded her memories and personality into, while simultaneously giving it the directive that it loved Bear and Bailey more than anyone in the entire world. This is why, in the first moments that not Nikki appears, she seems confused and acts bizarrely, because she's blank spiritual or supernatural matter that has been forcibly made to be a direct copy of this woman in a matter of seconds, and so it's getting used to existing for the first time. And because it never was a human, and is only a thing attempting to be a human, for the rest of its existence, it will simultaneously act in ways you'd expect a human to, and in ways that you wouldn't, with its willow-given purpose causing it to behave in ways that satisfies its overwhelming need to love Bear as much as humanly possible, and its movements being strange and creepy as it tries to behave in ways it feels it needs to in response to any given situation involving Bear, whether positive or negative. And when you consider that not Nikki is likely warring with the real Nikki for control over her body throughout this story, it makes sense that it will often move in ways that reflect the confusing storm of emotions, both artificial and drawn upon, that are raging inside of it, especially after things start to fall apart for it. A great example of how this thing is attempting to make do with Nikki's own experiences, while simultaneously attempting to do what it feels is best in order to please Baron, is given to us early into her transformation, when she takes Sandy out of the trash and creates a shrine to her for Bear. When Bear sees this, he's understandably freaked out, but not Nikki is confused, as it knows that Baron just lost his cat, and by rummaging through Nikki's memories, it knows that's not a good thing. So in an attempt to make him feel better, it does what it's seen other people do in Nikki's memories when they're faced with death. It creates a memorial to Sandy, a thing to help Bear cope with her passing, and to revere her. But it doesn't understand that there's a distinct difference between holding a funeral for someone or an animal, and digging their corpse out of the trash and making a shrine to them on the kitchen floor. That's why, when Bear stumbles upon this scene, not Nikki is confused, unable to understand why the supposedly helpful thing is upsetting Bear. And when he says it's fucked up, she says she doesn't know if it's fucked. And when Bear replies that it is, she hesitantly asks if that's good, which is a perfect example of how not Nikki is only mimicking human behavior in the way it believes is best, and doesn't understand why that behavior is less than adequate at times. Despite this, for a time after they officially enter a relationship, things are rather picturesque for the couple, with a whirlwind romance ensuing that's everything Bear could have ever hoped for. But not Nikki is not Nikki, and so once it's forced to face anything new or adverse, it begins to behave in ways that are utterly psychotic as it attempts to figure out what to do, and deal with the negative emotions it has that it isn't supposed to have, because any amount of perceived negativity from Bear or anyone around him is taken as a direct assault on its prime directive, to love him more than anyone else, and to receive that same love from him in turn. And because this is essentially its only function, when that function starts to go off the rails, it malfunctions. This is why there's a slow degradation of not Nikki's sanity as this story progresses, because not Nikki is the idealized version of Nikki that Bear had in his mind made manifest. And when the fantasy starts to come into contact with reality, not Nikki begins to break, and to break everything around it in order to make sure that what it was made for is maintained no matter the cost. But with all the horrifying and abusive things we see not Nikki do in this film in mind, does that mean that not Nikki is evil? No, I don't think so. Everything in Not Nikki's mind is superseded by its directive to love Bear, so morality is arbitrary for it. It likely knows from Nikki's memories that what it's doing is wrong at points, but that doesn't matter, because nothing matters more to it than ensuring its love for Bear and his love for her is protected at all costs. Because I think that's true, I don't feel it's right to label Not Nikki evil, as it's more so an automaton attempting to fill its function than anything else. No, what's really evil in this story is Bear and the wish he made, but that wasn't the case initially. As we discussed earlier, Bear making the wish he did was more so made out of frustration and desperation than anything, and he, like anyone else, couldn't have imagined that this wish would actually come true. The wish itself is evil because it's one that's designed to force another person into doing something or becoming something against their will. But again, he had no real way of knowing that this wish would be fulfilled. But once that wish was fulfilled, and Bear willingly chose to ignore Not Nikki's behavior so he could enjoy her love like he always wanted to, slowly but surely, his actions become more and more nefarious. At first, he does seem apprehensive about this new Nikki, as he even admits to Ian that she was acting strangely the day after he made the wish. But he does withhold the fact that he made that wish from him, instead trying to rationalize it in other ways, which Nikki seemingly does for him when she tells Ian that she was drunk and high the night before. Now, to be fair, he probably didn't want to mention the wish to Ian because of how absurd it would sound, but the fact remains that even after he discovered a memorial to his cat on his kitchen floor, he didn't think to investigate the One Wish Willow further or do anything to reverse what he'd done to this girl. Maybe, in these beginning stages, he didn't believe that his wish actually worked, or he was in denial. But perhaps that's giving him too much credit, as he was more than willing to enjoy the fruits of this sudden affection she had for him without really thinking twice about what he'd done, what she had done, and what she was becoming. This only becomes more egregious as the film progresses, as even after strange behavior, Bear still does his best to move past and ignore these things due to his selfish need to have this woman all to himself and to enjoy her love, even when he understands that this isn't the real Nikki and expresses that he wants this falsified version of her to be more like the real Nikki. But the most damning moment for Bear in this entire film, the moment that puts aside any doubt about how horrendously self-centered he is the scene where Nikki manages to break through while Not Nikki is sleeping, and she begs him to end her life, telling him in so many ways how much she's suffering as a prisoner in her own body, or somewhere else far more sinister. Bear's only response is to think of himself, to ask her what's so bad about being with him, before he walks away as she continues to plead for freedom. This, along with every little thing in this film about Bear that points to his selfish nature, is what ultimately brands him a villain. An accidental villain at first, but a purposeful one in the end. One who willingly ignores the suffering of a woman that he's essentially made into his love slave by inviting this manufactured version of her into her body. A slave that mirrors all the worst tendencies of Baron Bailey, the cries of anguish that are fabricated for the sake of gaining pity, and an idealized love that's as warped and twisted as the fantasized Nikki he created in his mind. There is another source of evil in this film, the One Wish Willow, and the people behind its making and distribution. But its evil is akin to a genie's, who, through granting wishes, are not necessarily in control of what happens when these wishes are granted, or will grant these wishes in the most literal ways possible, without regard for the consequences they may bring, which is only emphasized by the owner of the shop that sells them mentioning that he had his wish granted, but has seemingly only benefited from it, likely because of the nature of his wish. However, unlike genies, whose moral designation often remains ambiguous, it would seem that whoever or whatever is behind the One Wish Willow is far more malicious, as when Bear calls the hotline on the box for help, the person or thing on the other end taunts him with the screams of the trapped Nikki, telling him that the only way to end her suffering is to end her or end himself, something that the shop owner echoes so casually that it's hard to believe they aren't satisfied in some way by this outcome. As much as that's true, Bear is still responsible here for stringing this affair on as long as he did, with every ounce of harm coming to Nikki, Sarah, and Ian coming as a result of his actions and his willingness to endanger them for the sake of his own desires. And even in the end, even when two of his dearest friends have paid the price for his negligence, when given the opportunity to make up for some of what he's done by ending his own life, he hesitates, attempting to vomit up the pills he's just ingested with the likely hope that he'll be able to salvage this situation in some way. As after all, this is everything he ever wanted, right? Both fortunately and unfortunately for Nikki though, Not Nikki, consumed by its obsession and fearing Bear growing apart from it, chooses to use the One Wish Willow to gain his eternal love. But it's too late, and the only person left standing now is the real Nikki, utterly confused, lost, and broken beyond repair amongst a sea of carnage that was unleashed by her hands, but not at the same time. And at this end, we find that it was Bear, the quietly narcissistic and cowardly young man who needed to be wanted by the object of his obsession more than anything, to be the prime evil in this story. The man who, at any time, was more than capable of making efforts to free this woman from her torment, but actively chose not to, instead ignoring all the horror he unleashed through her, so he might live out a dream come true. There are two old adages that encapsulate what happens in this film perfectly. Be careful what you wish for, and if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And throughout this story, Bear was shown that he should have been careful, and that what he wished for was too good to be true. But he didn't care. He only ever cared about himself. Curry Barker expressed in an interview that this film, and the relationship we see between not Nikki and Bear, is meant to present to us viewers the worst aspects of toxic relationships. Relationships where both parties are guilty to some degree of behaving in ways that are abusive, harmful, and dangerous. And while it does accomplish that quite well, in this case, in this scenario, Nikki is not at fault here, nor is not Nikki, for one is innocent, and the other a creation of an insidious wish that was granted to a wholly self-centered, spineless, and weak man who cares not for anyone but himself and his own well-being. And for that, and for everything that unfolded in this story as a result of the fantasies of Baron Bailey, he will forever and always remain a villain, and a man who sacrificed all around him, and himself, to evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Obsession? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially our Dark Lord patrons, Elijah Kai VA, Mr. Awesome, Louis Dockstater, Just Keeping It Real, Lachlan, Atris Rain, Seltsopa, Him Downstairs, Oh God Why, Beep Boop, Lorenzo Antonino, Eli Livingston, Moondog, and Roberto Hernandez. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.